Does grain sorghum have a future? Will you be farming it? Will your kids be eating it? What about trade? We're talking all things sorghum, potentially the crop of the future for a lot of reasons. I've got the CEO of Kansas Sorghum Growers Association on this episode of The Business of Agriculture. Are you looking for productive efficiencies in growing higher yielding, better performing crops? New Fields Ag provides a complete portfolio of biological products focused on you, the farmer. Visit newfieldsag.com for more information to help you farm better. Hey there, welcome to another fantastic episode of The Business of Agriculture. I misspoke. It's actually the CEO of the Kansas Sorghum Producers. His name is Adam York. I read about him in the Wall Street Journal back this spring, and the title of the article, the headline said, "The New It Crop Has a Brand Problem." And I said, whoa, this intrigues me. I said, I think I know of these people because I keep up with the sorghum business. I had 3 years, and about 2 months ago, I had on a guy, and we talked about sorghum being an answer in a water-restricted future. I still believe that that is one of its highest and best opportunities, because we will be under the gun on water use, especially in more arid areas in the plain states, if you will. The problem is we can grow sorghum. It's a low-cost crop to produce. It makes a lot of sense for arid regions. It's got higher protein content. It works as a silage. It works as a grain. It works going straight to consumer. Not a lot of things we grow do that, right? Can't take field corn really eat it as a human. Can't take soybeans eat it as a human, but you can with oats, certain parts of wheat, and also sorghum. There's a lot of opportunity here. But as the Wall Street Journal says, it's an it crop, but it has a brand problem. And I'm just wondering about the future. So Adam York, thanks for being on here. We've been trying to get you on here for a little bit now. Sorghum. Most people don't think about it. It's still like just this, our country's number 7th or 9th most produced crop after corn, soybeans, wheat. Then you get into rice and you get into a whole bunch of stuff. You guys are out there in the hinterlands.
We'll say it's the 5th most important cereal grain in the world, we'll say. But when we talked about Kansas, we're talking about sorghum. We talk about sorghum in a lot of ways. We are talking about Kansas because Kansas farmers grow half of the entire sorghum crop in the nation. Now, it's a small crop. It's about 1/15 the size of corn or soybeans this year. Corn has a big acreage boost, but you're talking about corn, soybeans, 80, 90 million acres year over year. Sorghum, usually about 5 to 7 million acres. So small crop in the U.S. and Kansas, very big crop, especially the state's prominence within the sorghum industry. Typically Kansas and Texas. Kansas being the number 1 producing state, Texas being number 2, and then you got some more sorghum belt states, we'll say, from South Dakota to Texas that really jockey up there in number 3, 4, and 5. But you described it well, and thanks for having me. Always glad to get on and talk about this crop and its future. Its future is bright, but we certainly see a lot of challenges as well in the here and now. But yeah, the potential here and kind of what we're working on from an industry, from a farmer perspective here is really multi-generational, sets up a lot of positive momentum going forward.
The gist of this article in the Wall Street from spring of 2025 just talked about China was retreating, meaning they were going to stop buying our stuff. This was toward the beginning of the whole trade spat. China had become a big customer, and we can get into the trade part because you're working a lot to try and get trade going. And I want to talk about the challenges of trade, and I want to talk about just the challenges with new demand for any crop, because we're damn good at making crops here in the United States. It always becomes the issue of where do we go with it. And before I do that, I want to talk about what the basics of sorghum and why it has a lot of, I think, potential. But again, so did Kernza, and so does quinoa and other things that we can grow. Probably flax, I don't know. But being good and having a lot of things that make it good are obviously attributes, but then there's still the issue of we're not demanding very much. We don't use very much sorghum. So let's talk a little bit about sorghum in general. I call it sorghum. I call it grain sorghum. Your producers probably call it Milo. There's no difference, right?
That's right. No difference. Grain sorghum, Milo are usually the closest interconnection there. I know John talked 3 years ago on your show here about some of the historical factors about why that is. Kind of like lamb or mutton. You have 2 different vernaculars for the same product. But scientifically, sorghum bicolor is the genus and species name. So sorghum there becomes kind of that sticky name. But sorghum or grain sorghum, depending on the use, versatility usually gets a little closer there. So grain sorghum specifically, we're talking about the head of the plant, the berries, the grain, the most probably common photo that we'll see of Googling sorghum is that nice level field going into the horizon of a bright red crop against some really verdant greens of the leaves. But we can also talk about sorghum being a forage, being a silage product, and that really comes into the future of the high plains with a lot of consumer trends looking at whole milk dairy production coming on from California to Kansas and West Texas, eastern New Mexico. The future of sorghum, in a lot of ways, is the future of forage and the future of dairy.
Yeah, so let's just point out here that, okay, sorghum, if it's kind of a grass type plant, it would look like corn to a lot of people that don't know any better until it gets to a certain point. But as opposed to corn, which shoots an ear, grain sorghum puts the grain on the top of the plant toward the end of its life, or midlife, I guess you would say, and then it gets harvested. So it can get harvested as a grain, and just like corn can, or you can chop the whole entire plant when it's got more moisture content and then make it for cow feed as silage. To Adam's point, Texas has been the most rapidly expanding dairy producing state. Obviously, South Dakota's done a bunch of that. Some of these middle of the country states have seen a big growth in dairy production. So this does work. My tenant is a dairy farmer, and he did experimenting with putting out sorghum as silage. You say, why you would do that? You might not get as many tons per acre as you do off of corn. It's about half the price to put it out, though, right?
Right. Yeah. And then when you look at what crop you want to put out when you have as much water as you could possibly want, when you're trying to get water off the fields, sorghum really doesn't become part of that conversation. When you're struggling to figure out how am I going to grow a crop with low soil moisture profile and the outlook for rains or perhaps irrigation wells that are running dry, that's where sorghum for grain or for forage really comes into the mix. So really it's how will it out yield corn when you don't have the water or the resources?
Mm-hmm. And it does that. So let's talk about it as a human. So growth, that's cool. Growth as cow feed is great because then the sorghums are going. But that's kind of like corn. Obviously, most corn that's grown in the United States has never ended up on the dinner plate of America. Sure, as processed food and corn chips and that kind of thing. But generally, it goes to ethanol. 40% of the corn crop goes to ethanol, or it goes to chickens, pigs, and cattle, and then ends up on your dinner plate as animal protein. So grain sorghum as cow feed, perfect, wonderful. But it's got another use for going to humans. And I think that's what was interesting about this Wall Street piece, Adam, is that it said it's the it crop. It's got all kinds of things going for it, but somehow it's still not catching on. Higher in protein than many things. We can eat it ourselves. So let's talk about it from those standpoints of the human consumption aspect of it. And then we talk about trade.
Yeah, human consumption, I think, is kind of the pedestal market that we want to look at, and what what my organization, Kansas Sorghum Producers, as well as the National Sorghum Producers, you've spoken to in the past, the United Sorghum Checkoff Program, the farmer-funded promotional board for farmers across the nation, have really been eyeing this high-profile market because we do have an extended play in our export oriented market development. That's been China. And we can talk about the reasons for why so much sorghum, over half the crop, has gone to China over the last decade. But specifically, and you mentioned it, I mean, cattle feed, this has been when we talk to grocery store chains about looking at food grade sorghum specifically, the kind of the most pinnacle, most scrutinized, highest quality sorghum grain that we can get, really ultimately because we want to feed it to ourselves and to our children. How do we disassociate from a feed grain from feeding cattle or feeding pigs or going into the combustion engine of an automobile? So that's really where, I wouldn't say that I disagree with the article's headline that there is a brand problem, because we have for 50 years in the U.S., probably 75 years in the U.S., grown sorghum to be culturally aware of its use in a feed grain or as a biofuel over the last decade. Not so much. I grew up on a wheat and cattle farm in Southwest Kansas. Did not eat a lot of milo. Saw lots of fields going between my hometown and Dodge City, which is where we'd go for fun, but never considered eating it. And then the same notion with students today in school meal programs or at our university. We have programs with Kansas State University. I'm in Manhattan. Kansas State is just down the road. To get sorghum into their dining services, how do we look at that cultural adaptation? So from a domestic market standpoint, certainly one for growth, but then we back up, Damian, go back, a few hundred, several thousand years. Sorghum is one of the oldest human consumed cereal grains on the planet because of where it evolved, where it developed in the Horn of Africa. That's Eritrea, Kenya, Ethiopia, specifically where the
Sure,
grain
it's one of
is.
the earliest cultivated crops, and it obviously has a drought tolerance. It handles heat based on where it's from, which is why it's still grown in places like the Panhandle of Texas. And again, it doesn't. It's not like the soybean where you got to figure out how to mash it and cook it to get something out of it that we can actually digest. You can eat grain sorghum. I mean, you just grind it up and eat it right there, right?
We had a team of buyers into a field in southwest Kansas, and the farmer said, just take some of those berries and pop it in your mouth. You can tell if it's ready to harvest or not. And so it was not yet ready to harvest, but the fact of the matter is that any sorghum virtually can be food grade sorghum, what we call. Now, the food grade sorghum that consumers do buy is going to meet some extremely strict quality standards.
Right.
And we have some very dedicated sorghum flour mills in Kansas because there's that value added potential to look at what we have with this crop, see a future use for it, and really meet some growing consumer trends for some of these health aspects that they're looking at.
Yeah, so I want to get into trade. I want to get into problems with sorghum, why it's not catching on more. But I want to talk then about how it works for human-derived, human-consumed food, because I think that's, like you said, a real opportunity if you can tap it. Before I get into that, I want to talk to you about my friends at Harvest Returns. I'm wearing their hat right here. Good looking lid, isn't it? If you have a need for money for your agricultural operation, could be a farm, could be a ranch, could be animal processing, could be a sorghum venture with a new brand. Sometimes you need money and it doesn't fit the template of a traditional bank. Banks are fine. Friends of Farm Credit, they're fine. But you know what? Sometimes you're looking for something that doesn't quite fit what they do. Doesn't mean you're sunk. You can find money. Money is out here to help you do that through our friends at Harvest Returns. Harvest Returns basically has a bunch of investors, thousands of investors, in fact, and they put that investor money together, and then they look at your option and your opportunities and decide what your options are to get you funded. They've got all those investors. They have creative financing options that fit you. So if you want to take your operation to the next level and you need capital to do so, don't think just because the bank turned you down that you're done. You're not. Go to harvestreturns.com to learn more about how you can get started with growing your operation today. If you're an investor with a whole bunch of money and you like to make plays in agriculture, Harvest Returns might be a fit for you as well. Chris Raleigh is my friend down there. He's a Texas-based company, but it doesn't matter where he is, doesn't matter where you are. The point is where there's opportunity. Go to harvestreturns.com to learn more about taking your operation and your money to the next level. On the human side of it, it's higher in protein. It's got the adjustability. You've got the environmental angle on it. You know, you don't use as much harsh chemistries necessarily to produce it, is my understanding. You don't have as much of a water demand for it. Checks a lot of boxes.
For consumers who are looking for the product at the grocery store, specifically regarding what kind of alternative grains, typically sorghum has met that kind of gluten-free celiac disease consumer. And there's a lot of Americans across the country who say, oh yeah, I've was looking for new recipes because my daughter or my niece or my father is gluten intolerant. And so we'll back up and say all of our sorghum farmers usually will always have a wheat crop. So this is purely where the consumer market angle is. Sorghum, when we talk about milling it in the U.S. for flour products, it usually has a gluten-free alternative. Now, I grew up on a wheat farm. Would say that our farmers will sell wheat into the marketplace for very delicious gluten products. But sorghum really fits this production region very well, and it's a summer crop. Wheat was planted in September, October, right about now. The sorghum crop is just about to come off for harvest. So within the rotation system, that sorghum farmer that's going to be marketing the premise of sorghum as a gluten-free alternative grain is also about to sell their very high gluten wheat crop as well. So we talk about what can the farmer do to meet the end consumer. They got two options here. They have this product in sorghum. They have a product in wheat. Because of where it's grown in western Kansas and West Texas, that overlays the wheat production, fall wheat production areas of the U.S. That's two pretty phenomenal crops. So do we favor one or the other? I wear sorghum on my back. I'm farmer funded by sorghum farmers, but they are very rotation intensified by virtue of where they grow on the high plains.
So let's talk about why there's a big benefit. So there's the environmental angle. You can say this is a very water efficient crop. And it's got a lot of things and components of it. But then they're going to say, well, how do I eat it? That's fine. You've told me on it, Damian. Great. I want to eat sorghum. How? And that's the tough part. There's a field out there in Kansas, and then there's me with a dinner plate saying, I'll try it. But where the hell do I get sorghum? How do I use it? flour, but I got to go to some specialty store. I mean, let's face it, it's not on the shelf at Kroger.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges of getting that shelf space. And so we have seen uptick. USDA keeps, I think it's Food Data Central, keeps a database of registered grocery products, and that's doubled from about 800 in 2017 to about 1,700 just last year. It is growing. It is in prominence. We see more SKUs, more product lines looking to incorporate sorghum. But if they haven't tried it, then it's kind of an unknown. One of my jobs in the past was to look at how sorghum as an ingredient and some of the production standpoints of producing the crop with a low water score, with a low carbon intensity score, similar to the ethanol credit market, how that might influence the overall carbon intensity or sustainability, we'll say, of a final finished packaged good in a grocery store shelf. And then specifically what kind of claim can be made quantifiable as to what kind of conservation practices those farmers are taking. Well, sorghum meets that bill very well because of the nature of where this sorghum crop is produced. And I've sent you the maps. It's a heat map with a whole lot of heat in Kansas. Well, we go back 100 years, it was the Dust Bowl. Farmers didn't then utilize summer crops to keep that dust on the ground. Today, about 75% of sorghum farmers are reduced till. That reduced tillage is an environmental story that end consumers may want to see or certainly help promote in keeping those soil resources and that carbon in the ground. That's certainly something that farmers, I think, have an interest in, but specifically if they can get a premium by doing practices they're already doing, farmers are going to look at how they can continue to promote that aspect of it too.
Yeah. But like I said, then you said getting it on the grocery stores, you're trying to do that. You need this is the tough part. A lot of people don't grasp this that don't work in the industry. Say my neighbors that I live part of the time in the winter in Arizona, they're fine. They would try this. They don't have any idea how to go about it. And they say, well, you know what? Those Kansas farmers need to put their stuff where I can buy it. Well, and I hear the farm people, they're just as ignorant in terms of how the thing works as the suburbanites are. The suburbanites saying, well, those farmers need to put their stuff where I can eat it. And then the farmer's saying, well, the middleman's making all the money. And I always had to point out, the middleman, this evil middleman, is about 14 steps. After it leaves your farm, it goes to an elevator. Then the elevator, it gets on a train. And then from there, it goes to somewhere that's going to then parceled out into this and this and this. And then it gets processed. And then from there, it gets processed again. And then it gets packaged. And then it gets into a consumer. Then it gets handled. Then it gets taken to a store. That's the problem, is that there's a bunch of layers. You're out here on behalf of the sorghum industry, but you can't effectively make up for those 12 layers between the farm and the consumer.
So it's a similar problem when we have sorghum looking at how do we make this circular economy for our local communities. Well, we have all these schools. Think of a school cafeteria where I grew up, kind of like a feedlot. A lot of mouths to feed within a confined space. We worked to get sorghum onto essentially school menus across the nation through USDA a few years ago. The problem there, Damian, what you just mentioned is, it's a little bit different with fruits and veggies, which you can come straight from the field. For sorghum, you got to, in some ways, to make it into a value-added product, you do have to process it. And so there is a mill, like you said, and that has not historically been the market model for the sorghum industry, where it's been primarily, straight to an elevator, like you just said, and then shipped to a feedlot or directly integrated into a cattle rancher's operation. You do need some of that kind of processing to move it into a flour or to pearl it. But certainly, as consumers continue to demand that, and as that demand there, farmers and the industry supply chains will start building that out. So with just a few mills around the nation that can handle sorghum, the more businesses, the more end consumer packaged goods companies on the back end of that chain, we are seeing a bit of that expansion there. But it is a challenge because we have wheat and we have all these wheat mills and we have a high production capacity for wheat flours. Hasn't always been the case for sorghum.
Right. And by the way, as you said, many of your producers are both wheat and sorghum producers because it works well for a rotation. You're kind of cannibalizing. And the most common way that sorghum is going to get used, as we're talking about it, would be if it was ground into flour, and then it becomes a wheat replacement. And the person that's out there growing says, "What the hell did I just do? I just sold less of my wheat to sell more sorghum. How am I further ahead?" The only answer I would say is you've answered another pallet demand. The
Correct.
consumer that says, I've already consumed too much wheat products. I've already, I've read the book Wheat Belly, and I see that it's too much gluten and all that kind of thing. That's probably the benefit.
Well, and specifically, the sorghum flour mills are dedicated sorghum flour mills. So what does that mean? Is that there is no wheat that goes into that mill, so that there's no, contamination is a strong word, but because of the proteins and the gluten that comes with wheat, that's exactly why consumers are looking for a gluten-free product. So the infrastructure there is very young and fresh, but exciting, I think. So the future is bright when it comes to how this crop can impact essentially this middle of the country that doesn't receive a whole lot of water to keep it economically viable going forward.
And that was the gist of the episode I did a little more than 3 years ago, was that it answers the water thing. But here's what we don't do, and we haven't gotten there yet. We could produce, says 6 million acres, double that, triple that. Trust me, I get around these places. There's plenty of arid parts of the United States of America that would be perfectly suited to grow sorghum. But right now, your guys are growing at a loss, just like the corn and soybean and the wheat and everything else. Its cost of production right now exceeds market price, correct?
That's correct.
That's tough.
It's tough.
And then we're recording this mid-October of 2025, just for the listener that says, wait a minute, that's not true. I'm going with what the prices are today that my friend Adam and I know. We don't know when you're listening to this. So that being said, you have a situation where, like everything we say, we just need to sell more. Well, where's it going to go?
So we think about the current price today, and it is tough. And I have to put my mind into the mindset of the farmers that I work for. It's about $3 a few pennies for a bushel of sorghum. When you recorded with my colleague John Duff 3 years ago, it was about double that, $6 to $7. There are a number of reasons for that. Low supply from the 2022 drought. And we had, corn and sorghum both hit with that.
Yep.
But also you had high demand in the COVID era with people, moving some supply streams, a number of supply streams, reintegrating that way. Today, it's a little bit different picture. Sorghum has been a bigger crop in the past. And I think, go back to the 1970s, it was about 15 million acres, so about 3 times as large. That's where a lot of my work is working with our public researchers and the commercial seed industry space to say, how can sorghum continue to become a crop technology that farmers want to put out there? So that's on the front end of it, the production side. Now on the back end, if you can have this super high tech genetic trait package in a sorghum crop, it's still got to go somewhere at the end of the day into that end consumer. And so that's the marketing side that we work on. I say to the farmers that I go out, especially this year, production is one side of the coin, markets are the other side of the coin. Both will impact that producer profitability. So historically, it's been easy to say a third of the sorghum crop was exported, a third went to feed grains, and a third went to ethanol. Well, it kind of gets a little blurry there when China came into the market in a big way in 2014. Sorghum was specifically attainable to Chinese swine producers, some of the largest swine processing plants in the world, not just in China, but anywhere in the world that happened to be there in China. The economic factors were just right for the sorghum industry a decade ago for half of the crop essentially to go into China at a premium, because there was a policy mechanism that allowed sorghum to go into China tariff-free compared to imports of corn. So when you look at the feed grade standpoint, they need to meet their own added value protein needs. Sorghum was able to just move in there the right place, right time. That's created sort of a vacuum for other markets internationally. Mexico has been the largest institutional buyer of U.S. sorghum, derailed directly.
The largest
south.
what?
Institutional buyer.
Okay.
It's an international institutional buyer, and that's been for cattle feedlots in Mexico.
Okay, so real quickly, there's a lot of people saying, wait a minute, we're talking about this stuff as cereal. No, just again, compare it to, I would almost, it's somewhere in between the wheat and the corn, if you will. It's got more protein than corn, right? It's got a higher protein content, but again, humans can eat it, but also animals can eat it. And so when you just made the point, you said that it was coming into China tariff-free. A lot of people are thinking, because we're recording this October 2025, that this whole tariff thing is a brand new thing invented by Donald Trump. Who was president in 2014, Adam? I know you were still in high school. Who was president in 2014?
Barack Obama was president. President Obama
and China was tariffing United States agricultural products in 2014. I thought this was all just because the mean yellow man or orange man, whatever they call him. The point is, sorghum got a leg, a nose under the tent, or a leg in the door, or whatever you want to call it, a foot in the door, because there were tariffs against American agricultural products in 2014, but not sorghum.
And that was unique because we were a small crop. And so when you have that advantage, it worked sort of like a vacuum. The Chinese swine processors who have been utilizing sorghum for a while. Sorghum is great in the swine industry. It makes one of my favorite proteins, ham and bacon. We're able to just come in and really become the highest bidder for the U.S. sorghum farmer. And then that over 10 years means that you have some institutional churn at these other plants around the country. People are less educated, where their predecessors who prior had their role in 2014 in Mexico or other nations in utilizing the grain. So part of our efforts this last 9 months has really been, well, what are our domestic markets and how can we diversify our international markets? So that's what we've been working on the last 10 months. So I mentioned the third breakdown for our end uses. This is a crop that could go 70% export in 1 year. Biofuel could take 60% the next year. If we can grow the human consumer food, which has historically been about 5% of the crop, that's a buffer that's going to add some price stability for the farmer. Not just price stability, but usually there's a premium. This is a premium product.
That's the point I was going to make. A lot of folks are saying, why do you care if humans consume this directly? I think acres of sorghum are acres of sorghum. Just get the stuff out there. There's a premium associated with, remember, oats that go to granola bars to be sold at Whole Foods get a bigger price premium because of the contents, the purity, maybe how they're raised, if they're organic, whatever, than horses that go to a calf feed ration that comes in a bag that you buy at Tractor Supply. And it's just the way it is, right? So
it's
that's
kind of a chicken or the egg. Yeah, it's kind of a chicken or the egg situation. Those food companies want a very specific formulation on the back of their ingredient label, and they don't want to have to mess that around because they're having to print off, they're having to pay for printing supplies, things like that. So they want stability of supply. Sorghum
and consistent stability of consistent product supply.
Correct. And then the farmer wants demand. The farmer will say, my farmers will say, provide the demand and we'll grow it. And certainly I think that's true. Sorghum specifically, when you can add it in as a premium product, that will encourage the production of sorghum. Then it becomes a resource conservation thing where we're looking at putting a sorghum crop down, maybe under an irrigation pivot that was previously in continuous crop for corn. That can help a farmer also reduce their water footprint because the farmer's going to grow what makes the farmer the most money. In Kansas, that's going to be a range of crops, and the farmer has a suite of options at their disposal, and that's a good thing. We work to make sure sorghum continues to be one of those because it does have an interplay there with saving water resources under the High Plains aquifer.
I want to get into then the trade issue, and if this is going to end up being a bright spot for sorghum, because remember, I'm for being a Northeast Indiana kid. If I put out some sorghum, it's just going to be for a wildlife plot. But anyway, I'm a sorghum fan. I want this to be good. Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk to you about nitrogen. Speaking of how different crops are better with nitrogen, you know, we overuse nitrogen. I'm not being mean. I shot a video about this, walking along my drainage ditch. We got to start looking in production agriculture. You, if you are in the business of agriculture, really need to start thinking about this because it's not going to be long. I absolutely predict you are going to have to submit a nutrient management plan, just like the livestock people do. If you want to grow crops, you're going to have to talk about pounds you're putting out there. You're going to have restrictions on what the ground is. If the ground is frozen, different temperatures. Nitrogen is the new boogeyman. So how do you get the most out of the nitrogen that you are going to apply? Why don't you use products like Redox Grows? Redox is RDXN. It's backed by more than a decade of research. It's gaining a lot of momentum with growers, including the people like my friends right here in the Midwest that grow corn and soybeans. RDXN is patented, proven, plant-active botanical extracts designed to improve your nitrogen efficiency by 50% while boosting your crop's quality and consistency. If you want to learn more about their product and how you can cut back on nitrogen and use some RDXN, go to redoxgrows.com. That's redoxgrows.com. Trade. I know that right now we're recording this. Everybody, and I made my little crack about the tariffs thing because everybody thinks this is a new thing. This has been going on for a long time. Agriculture gets used as a bargaining chip, as a weapon. China obviously thinks they're going to harm things here in the United States if they don't buy our soybeans. This happens. But China already started pulling back on their sorghum. They were, like you said, the bulk of our exports went to China.
Over the last
decade. It for booze. They were using it for booze, too.
Yeah, over the last decade. And so China replaced the Mexican market in 2014. But I think 5 million metric tons, about half the crop in 2014. The next year had an acreage boost from that demand. I think 8 million metric tons of 12 or 13 million metric tons in 2015. And then there was a bit of
to put those again,
demand.
that doesn't mean to the average listener. So that was on a percentage of the 6 million acres that we farm. So is it safe to
That'd
say
be about 500 million bushels, about 500 million bushels. When you're comparing it to that production year,
half of our production?
half of the production, yeah, went to China over the last 10 years. We would welcome them back if they wanted to come back in. We had a team from China the last couple of weeks, and certainly appreciate that trading relationship. At the same point, if we can work to showcase what we have been working on from a genetic advancement portfolio of the sorghum crop, how it doesn't necessarily have a feed efficiency discount to corn. Usually it's about discounted about 10%. We've gotten that feed efficiency to about 95 to 98%. That's a new point over the last 10 years of sorghum crop improvement, which is really focused here in Kansas, that new buyers, new customers around the world may not be aware of. So part of the work of the farmers organizations is getting that word out, helping.
So what you just said there to the person that's in the cranberry business that dials into my show, there used to be a bigger deduct in terms of the net gain on an animal fed sorghum versus corn because of energy components, digestibility, et cetera, I assume.
Yeah, if you're feeding, if you're used to feeding an ingredient to or feed grain to your livestock, and then you have an alternative livestock that is about, you believe, 90% that efficiency, you're going to discount about a dime per bushel. Yeah, this is direct but relationship.
You don't have to now because you're within 5% of it, so there's still a little deduct, but the deduct is much less from terms of its sorghum's use as a feed stuff.
Correct. How do we get the crop more competitive into some of these diets, not just for humans, but certainly for animals? Ultimately, what we want to work on is as many market channels as possible, and give that farmer the opportunity for that competition. Because when there's competition in the marketplace, the farmer wins.
Okay. So on the trade front, China, do you believe that China, and I know this is all that anybody else is talking about in agriculture, I'm convinced they don't want to be our customer. They're not going to be our customer. Do you think they come back for the sorghum? Do they come back and grab half of the sorghum we produce, 1/3?
It's been a concern because South American sorghum production has really ramped up. That's been in the press last few weeks and months. We know that our U.S. sorghum varieties are much higher quality with the breeding infrastructure that we have in the U.S. This is a 75-year-old industry in the U.S. We know that our quality is unmatched across the globe, but at the same point, we have lost that market access over the last 10 months, and not just the tariffs, but then the threat of escalating tariffs certainly pull that decision process to, we need to diversify. So over the last 2 years, we've been looking at specifically what is a country at the scale of China that might be able to be a one-for-one replacement. And that's pointed us towards India. India has a number of those trade protection regimes that we are very aware of. I think the sorghum industry has been looking at India for several decades. Specifically,
by the way, everyone in ag has been going through this discussion and this thought process over the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years. Wait a minute. Up and coming economy, roughly the same population, actually a few more now than China, 1.3, 1.4 billion people, got an ascending economy. We'll just go ahead and start making India our customer. There's about 9 problems with that. Mm-hmm. They're a bitch to deal with. They are worse to deal with than China, is my understanding from all of my friends in various trade organizations in terms of trying to get a commitment from the Indians. Number 2, they seem to be much more protective. In other words, India is like the customer that you really don't want because they'll jump over a nickel. They are difficult to deal with, and they're also very protectionist of their own industry. And it seems to me they're certainly more cagey in that they will never be committed to any country, even as bad or worse than China. That's my perception.
We see huge potential there. There's a 50% tariff on U.S. sorghum, which we feel is unreasonably high. Been working to showcase how this could be a benefit to their domestic poultry industry. We've been working with their 50%
tariff on American sorghum. Is that because they're protecting Indian sorghum?
Could be, but they don't necessarily, in my mind, have enough domestic Indian sorghum production to really meet the needs. And then their sorghum is going to be high in tannins. High tannins because the U.S. industry has been a feed grain industry for 75 years, has bred the sorghum crop virtually to be tannin free, because then
Tannin is to reduce digestibility of livestock
bitter.
feed sources, right?
Correct. Yes, it's a palatability issue. The livestock, the poultry, they will not eat a high tannin grain. So the product is different. And when we had some Indian buyers over here, they didn't really believe us that our product is virtually undetectable in tannins. That's an advantage. But also they've got this thing called the GM ban, which they, similar to our advantage for the sorghum industry, or in China with the tariff rate quota on corn, but not on sorghum. Sorghum is non-GMO. Why is it non-GMO? It's a small crop. It hasn't had the kind of investment that other crops have had for those GM traits. We can utilize that as a marketing advantage, at least not necessarily saying one's better than the other, but as far as regulatory and tariff barriers, that's one less barrier that U.S. sorghum has going into India. So we have the 50% tariff, making it cost prohibitive to import U.S. sorghum. That's something that we've certainly been working on with our friends in the Indian poultry sector, as well as our collaborators in the U.S. and federal government. But also they've got some phytosanitary non-tariff trade barriers that we've also been working on to say, we want to make sure that the certifications are all tucked away. And once we have that, if we can get that market access, it'll still be a few years, but we see this as certainly something that could help. That's a big prize. The other diversification channels we've been working here at about 15 teams through the state of Kansas and into Texas, showcasing this phenomenal, I would say, record-breaking crop, because we have had rains. Again, another difference from your interview with John in 2022 was the worst drought in 100 years. We've now been kind of the wettest we've ever been in the last 100 years. That'll drop away. We'll probably have a drought here in another 2 years or so. But how do we move this huge crop off, whether that be through food grade, whether that be through biofuels? Certainly, exports remain a very important picture to that sort of price floor that sorghum farmers are able to achieve.
So what's your feel for India? Is it going to happen?
Anything could happen. I think that's been our posture over the last 9 months. It's getting close to make or break for a lot of these producers. That's something where field calls every week about what is the outlook here. Anything could happen, and until there's a deal, anything could happen. So that's probably the best I can say at that time.
So right now, India's sitting on their hands, and China's sitting on their hands. India's not sitting on their hands as well. So what's going to happen to this crop that's coming out of the fields? We're recording this, and the stuff's being harvested in the last month here, right?
It'll start really in full swing at the first freeze. The plant will die down. Farmers will be able to harvest it a little bit better with that dead stalk and capture the grain head. Vietnam remains one where we have market access. They are not primed to really utilize it because they haven't used it before. So we're looking at Vietnam as a potential large source market here in swine, as well as aquaculture, so catfish feeding. That would be a logistics.
And there's another by the way, the shrimp people. I don't know, but I know that you're talking Vietnam, Indonesia, India. Those countries grow the hell out of shrimp. If you eat a shrimp in the United States of America, there's a 93% chance it came from about one of those countries I just said, right? Vietnam,
they're likely utilizing wartime wheat from Ukraine or Russia. So this becomes, how can we geopolitically help our new friends in Vietnam or Indonesia, someone that's willing to drop their market barriers to give our U.S. production capacity access? How can we utilize them? Right now, sorghum is an extremely cost competitive grain because you're discounting the Chinese demand. So on a global feed grain scale, sorghum is going to make those companies a whole lot of money because their inputs have just dropped, because we grew this crop anticipating the Chinese market. I think that that's a risk for those Chinese companies, that they could be losing this entire U.S. production that could be sucked to a number of other channels. Vietnam, Indonesia, like you said, Philippines. Those are very high impact Southeast Asian markets that we simply need to showcase the utilization performance. For some of our buyers in Southeast Asia, they may be concerned about red sorghum discoloring the carcass meat. We make sure that we have the studies that can support the claim that actually this is not going to discolor your carcass meat, something that swine buyers from around the world have already known for a number of years. So those are good markets. Any market is going to be a good market.
You're in the middle of the country. This stuff doesn't go to the river. It probably goes by rail to the western ports then. Is that okay?
The Gulf of Texas or straight down to Mexico.
I see. So does that put you at a transportation disadvantage, or are you okay on that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Transportation in the interior is always going to be tough. So there are two distinct growing regions of sorghum in the U.S. You've got the high plains, South Dakota to West Texas, and a whole lot in Kansas. And then you've also got the coastal bend of Texas. The coastal bend of Texas, I say our exports are in a typical year, a non-exciting year, about 60%, 70% of the U.S. sorghum crop is exported. Well, if you're on the coastal bend right near Corpus Christi or Port of Brownville, usually it's 100% of that sorghum is exported.
Sure.
That grain sorghum is exported because you've got the terminals right there.
Because your cost of transportation is nil at that point.
And so they can factor that back into their price. If you move up to the interior, basis starts to dip a little bit. But in years where we do have high demand, like in 2022 when commodity prices were at an all-time high, the South Texas crop will move out. And usually what happened in 2021, because that was during the phase one agreement when China came back in under mandated purchase agreements, basis in the interior crept up as we had harvest coming off, which usually doesn't happen. So some funky economics at play there. But absolutely, the basis is directly attributable to how easily can we move the grain anywhere else in the country.
Yeah. So I want to know your thoughts where this goes. The article was, does the it crop have a brand problem? We think there's a lot of opportunities here. We've already covered it. The nutritional side, straight to human. It could be a good animal feed because of all the things we talked about. Less water demand. You can grow it more cheaply, et cetera, et cetera. It crosses off the non-GMO thing. That's a nice little checkbox for the whole foods type crowd. But oil doesn't go to none of this really goes to oil. That means you avoid the Maha RFK wrath because he's all anti-seed oil, and a lot of people are starting to question. Do you ever think, you're a little younger than me, that you'd have advocates now saying we want to fry our French fries in beef tallow? When I remember when all that stuff switched 40 years ago, we had to get away from anything like lard and go to healthy vegetable oil. Now it's not so healthy. Anyway, how much sorghum goes to oil? Not much, right?
Not much. No, not a whole lot. In fact, I probably couldn't tell you how much it is because I just haven't dealt with it to tell you
it's almost a non. Yeah.
So we already have some of those marketing channels baked in, for lack of a better term, because this is kind of the gluten-free crowd that would already be kind of looking at how is this, if they're looking at a food grade consumption perspective, they're going to be very sensitive to virtually every other aspect that you've mentioned. And if they're willing to pay a little bit more and juice up the supply chain back upstream to the farmer, that's something that we want to make sure that the farmer does receive that benefit for. We talk about the health attributes and the premiums there. We talk about the carbon intensity premiums. I mean, sorghum and corn can be interchangeable in biofuels. No, that can be a controversial subject there, but
Adam, if we actually do, it's been going on now for 5 years. We've been hearing about it. If companies are really going to pay farmers to offset their environmental boo-boos or usages or whatever, then a sorghum producer should be getting paid some sort of a stipend from some company that says, you use your carbon intensity index is so low. Is that help on the bottom line for these producers now or in the future?
Well, sorghum's pretty cool because we've had what we call an ecosystem service market in California for about a decade. Some of those high plains, Western Kansas, West Texas ethanol plants have been utilizing pathways into California that does see a premium if you're around an ethanol plant. Now, the challenge is those ethanol plants, they can't get up and move to areas of low basis around the state. So if you're buying an ethanol plant and you're growing sorghum as well as corn, you're probably growing both. Both of those are interchangeable feedstocks to that biofuel plant. On the backside, you get co-products. So our high plains distillers grains are going to be a mix of corn and sorghum going back into that added value protein supply chain. The same concept could be applied to the consumer food space. I would say probably a few years back as opposed to right now with consumer trends. But certainly there would be consumers who would be willing to pay more for a product. I wouldn't say in the last couple of years with inflation, certainly with tariffs on imported goods, some of that cost rising. But a few years ago when consumers were really, I think, interested in the story about where their food comes from, that's where we saw some of that initiative. I think that could come back, especially with consumer price power returning to them. I don't think it's right there right now.
Got it. And then your optimism, I'm not very optimistic about soybeans. I'm just I've heard all the stuff. I see this stuff on social media. When I see what's going on in South America, continually ramping up production, corn, we've been overgrowing it since I was born because we like to grow corn in America. I can make the case that I'm optimistic for sorghum, but I I have a hard time getting. I have a hard time seeing us go from 6 million to 18 million acres. I can make the case for it, but I don't know that I would place my bet on it.
It would have to come in states other than Kansas. And I'm a Kansan, and I think I have to be fully aware of that. There are about 23 million acres in Kansas, and those Kansas farmers will stick to their rotation regardless of the current market because they have this set rotation. Four crops over 5 years, 5 crops over 6 years. However, they have this, and they've been doing this for 10, 15 years already. Right. So they have that. So that acreage increase would have to come from elsewhere. So that's where corn and soybeans, they benefit from a private research and development standpoint. Companies can pour millions of dollars a week into their genetic advancement. Sorghum is a very democratic crop. The farmer, through their checkoff investments, are really guiding how this crop advances genetically and then comes back to the field to help them obliterate some of those challenges. We had huge demand from China in 2015. A lot of farmers thinking, hey, I'll try Milo again because I can get more comparatively on basis than the corn crop. And so they may have made a switch that year. And then we had a pest from Mexico come up with some warm winters, the sugarcane aphid. We didn't have any resistance to that pest because it was brand new. How does a small crop like sorghum go and combat new agronomic and environmental stressors? Well, we utilize the farmers' research investments. We work through some traditional breeding programs, and we obliterate that challenge in the field. So it's definitely had a number of challenges from the production standpoint. Certainly over the last decade, a couple of murkiness in the market standpoints as well.
Yeah. So you didn't answer my question. Are we still optimistic about the future of sorghum or not?
Absolutely optimistic because it becomes a water question. When you're talking about the future of sorghum, for me, my box is Kansas. You're talking about the future of sorghum in the state of Kansas, and the state of Kansas is beef and dairy as well. It's got to be sorghum, whether it's for grain or for forage, specifically for forage with dairy capacity coming on. Yeah. As the water resources, this is a very wet year in 2025 as opposed to 2022. 2025 is the year where no one's really talking about drought, and the concerns of the aquifer will come back when we have a very dry year. That's where we saw an increased investment from the state of Kansas towards sorghum genetic improvements this last spring come into play. The state, I think the industry sees sorghum's bright future in the next 10, 15, even 50 years as a crop that can produce with not a whole lot of resources when we're looking at a resource-limited environment.
I like it, by the way. Just out of curiosity, what's our average harvest? You talked about bushels here, $3 a bushel. How many bushels do I get on average in sorghum if I harvest? So
average, it's about 65 to 70 bushels. This year, I think we're going to be about 70 bushels. Now, you can put it under irrigation. You can get about 110, 150 bushels.
Yeah, but most of it isn't irrigated. So 70 bushels of dry land, that's only $210 of gross revenue per acre. So you're once you start putting tractor, a little bit of crop inputs and some time and some cash rent on there, it gets real skinny real fast, doesn't it?
It can be. But this is a volatile crop when it comes to demand, geopolitically sensitive, like you mentioned. There can be years where it's the main money maker. Compared on the input side to other crops like corn, it's a low input crop. So usually farmers will hedge that way one way or another.
The last thing, assuming that we're still going to continue to get older as a country, which we are, and assuming that our economics are okay, there is still that little teeny niche category of the sorghum that ends up in my bird feeder. How much does that amount to? A few percent of the acres?
A small percentage of the acres, but that's going to be the mid-Atlantic around the population centers. And that is a good market if you are in the Carolinas. If you're in the mid-Atlantic, you can get about $1 to $1.50 premium because there are just so many seeking people in the East Coast who want to feed the birds, watch them come in. And then, like I said, U.S. sorghum is low tannin by nature. If you're a sorghum industry in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and you have all these elevators, you want to make sure that everything going into the elevators from all these other farms is basically identical, it's homogenized. So that's why the industry worked to breed itself basically free of tannins so that everything on the back end is palatable. That's going to equate to a pretty darn good bird seed that if you have the opportunity to market that, it's going to be a good market for you.
Well, that's good. And you know what? Feed your birds. Feed the birds and buy some Milo. His name's Adam York. He's the CEO of the Kansas Sorghum Producers. Like I said, I think that there's a future for this. I'm as optimistic as I've been. I wrote about it in my book that I saw a lot of things changing, and the book came out 5 years ago, and I said, the corn and soy thing is overdone because eventually we're going to have too much supply for the demand. And I started talking about things like these overlooked crops, from flax to sorghum to Kernza, for crying out loud. So I think it's there. If they want to learn more about sorghum, where do they go?
You can visit our website at ksgrainsorghum.org. The best website for more information is going to be sorghumcheckoff.com. Sorghumcheckoff.com. Everything that goes on the Sorghum Checkoff website has to be peer reviewed, has to be cited, and has to be ultimately approved by United States Department of Agriculture. So if you're looking for authoritative information, go to sorghumcheckoff.com. You can find all the information, whether you're a consumer or if you're in the ag sector, you can see what those potentials might be.
It's Adam York. This is the picture right here of him. I mean, he's taller on camera than he is in real life. I know, I don't know that, but anyway, he was written up in the Wall Street Journal, and he's a good dude. So I appreciate you being on here. If you've enjoyed this episode, you know what? We're up to like 420 episodes. Releases every Monday. The Business of Agriculture. If you like listening to it on wherever you get your audios, please continue to do that. Share it with somebody who can benefit from it. Go over to my YouTube channel, hit subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. I'm really getting some big traction over on YouTube. I'd like for you to hit subscribe. It'll help continue to build what I'm building over there. If you do like my stuff, remember my new show, The Granary, is shot with my friends from XtremeAg right here at my on-farm tavern. Maybe one of these days we'll get Adam to come here and he can have an adult beverage and turn on the cameras, and we'll just talk about all things from Kansas to Indiana and in between. Anyway, that's what The Granary show is all about. Go check it out. Please share this. Thank you for being here. Until next time, I'm Damian Mason, and this is The Business of Agriculture. This episode of The Business of Agriculture was brought to you by my friends at New Fields Ag. American made, American known, focusing on the success of the American farmer. That's New Fields Ag, offering a complete lineup of high-performing biological products for you, the American farmer. Visit newfieldsag.com for more.